First of all, it's so good to see you, sir. It's been a long time, but it's always a joy to see you. It's an honor. Introduction of Frederick Douglass. You are in the midst of Mr. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818 in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. For the first 20 years of his slave life, he moved back and forth between the Eastern Shore and Baltimore. He escaped from slavery in 1838, taking a train from Baltimore, dressed as a sailor, eventually made his way to New Bedford, Massachusetts. He worked in the shipyards and as a minister, staying relatively quiet about his anti-slavery views, in part because he was still a fugitive slave and he was afraid of being caught and remanded back into slavery. In 1841, he gave an anti-slavery speech in Nantucket, Massachusetts. The great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison was in attendance. Garrison was so enthralled with Douglass' speech that he signed him up immediately as a paid anti-slave speaker. Douglass, with the help of Garrison's organization, moved his wife and 2 children to a house in Lynn, Massachusetts. Over the next several years, Douglass became an electrifying anti-slavery speaker for Garrison's anti-slavery society. Responding to the skeptics that someone as eloquent as Douglass could have been a slave, Douglass published a book, The Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book made him so famous that he had to flee to England to prevent being captured as a fugitive slave. While in England, Scotland, and Ireland, during 1845 to 1847, Douglass became an international anti-slavery celebrity. British supporters raised funds to buy him out of slavery in 1846, and in 1847, Douglass, now a free man, returned to the United States. He decided to go to Rochester, New York, instead of Massachusetts, because the British supporters had given him money to buy a printing press and start an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. If he had stayed in Massachusetts, he would have been in direct competition with Garrison's Liberator newspaper. Following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, Douglass became more radical in his anti-slavery philosophy and espoused involvement in the political agitation. The Revolution of 1776 and the fight for American independence from England was a great example of political resistance. That takes us to 1852, the year that Douglass gave what many believe is the greatest anti-slavery speech ever to be delivered in this country. What to the slave is the 4th of July. An address delivered in Rochester, New York on July 5th, 1852. Douglass insisted on giving the speech on July 5th instead of July 4th. He felt that until all African Americans were free, he could not celebrate the 4th. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear the meaning of July 4th for the Negro, otherwise known as What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Mr. Frederick.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
My pleasure.
I think with everything that you just said, I probably do not need to have more words. But I'm so happy to be with you this afternoon. Friends and fellow citizens. He who would address such an audience as this without experiencing a quelling sensation has stronger nerves than I do. I do not ever remember to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more strikingly with greater distress of my ability than I do on this day. The papers, the advertisements and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way for me. It is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who are now here and honor me with their presence. But neither their familiar faces nor my familiarity with this hall are a perfect gauge that seems to free me from any embarrassment. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the former to the latter are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of some gratitude. With little experience and with less learning, I have managed to throw my thoughts together, hastily and perhaps imperfectly, and trusting at this time in your patience and your generous indulgence, I will proceed to lay these thoughts before you. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birth of your national independence and of your political freedom. This to you is what Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of their own great deliverance, and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day. May the patriot not hope that high lessons of wisdom, of justice, and of truth will yet guide America to her destiny. Were America older, the patriot's heart might be sadder, and the transformer's brow much heavier. America's future might be shrouded in gloom, and the hope of her prophets go out in sorrow. However, there is consolation in the thought that America is still very young. Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called here today to speak? What have I, or those that I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice that are embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offerings to the national altar, the national table, and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then my task would be light, and my burden so easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him up? Who could be so obdurate and dead to the claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge this priceless benefits? Who could be so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee when the charms of servitude had been torn from his limbs? But such is not the state in this case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity that exists between us. For I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance that stands between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, of liberty, of prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought strife and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, but I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in glorious anthems are inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you citizens mean to mock me by asking me to speak today? Oh, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept and we remembered Zion. We hanged our lamps from the windows of the midst thereof, and there that carried us away captives required us to sing a song. And they who wasted us required us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of Zion in a strange land? O Jerusalem, if it forget thee, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Fellow citizens, beyond your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous, yesterday and today, rendered the more intolerable by the jubilous shouts that reach to them. If I do not forget, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme of the day would be treason most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before my God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. The simple story is this. Some 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in which you now glory, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government, and England as the fatherland. This home government, you know, although a considerable distance from your home, did in the exercise of its parental prerogatives impose upon the colonial children such restraints, such burdens and limitations as in its mature judgment it seemed wise and proper. But your fathers, who had not adopted the fashionable class of this day, of the infallibility of the government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the English government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and unoperative, and altogether such as ought to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Such a declaration of agreement on my part would not be worth much to anybody. It would certainly prove nothing as to what part I might have taken had I lived during that great controversy of 1776. To say now that America was right and England was wrong is exceedingly easy. It is fashionable to do so. But there was a time when to pronounce against England and in favor of the cause of the colonies tried men's souls. They who did not or were so accounted in their day, they were called plotters, mischief seekers, agitators, rebels, and dangerous men. Feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. Their conduct was wholly unexceptional. This, however, did not answer their purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn. Yet they persevered. They were not men to look back. Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men. And if they did not go mad, they became restive under this unjust treatment from England. They felt themselves the victim of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their mind and in their capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. And the idea of total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was startling then, much more so than now. At this distance of time, the timid and the product of that day were, and of course, shocked and alarmed by this strange idea. How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were your fathers' movements. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. They seized upon eternal principles and set a glorious example in their defense, fully appreciating the hardships that they had to encounter, firmly believing in the right of their cause, honorably inviting the scrutiny of the onlooking world, reverently appealing to heaven to attest to their sincerity, soundly comprehending the solemn responsibility they were about to assume, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them. Your fathers, the fathers of this republic, did most deliberately, under the inspiration of a glorious patriotism and with sublime faith in the great principles of justice and freedom, lay deep the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you even today. On the 2nd of July, 1776, the Continental Congress to the dismay and the lovers of ease and the worshippers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. Be it resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. My friends, your fathers made good on that resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you therefore may and ought to properly celebrate this anniversary. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the failure of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too great enough to give frame to a great age. It does not often happen. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly a most favorable point. And yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than my admiration. They were statesmen, they were patriots, and they were heroes. And for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I willingly unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests. And though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue. And then when it is exhibited, it ought to command your respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests and distractions. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but that knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out all the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. Shall we then look at this day, and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view? What is the American slave? to this 4th of July? I would give you an answer. A day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all great religious parade and solemnity, are to him, the slave, more bombast, more fraud, more deception, more impiety and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all of the monarchs and despotisms of the world, search every abuse, and when you have found the last of the abuses, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will agree with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns supreme without a rival.
Wow, amen.
Take the American slave trade, which we are told by reports is especially prosperous just now. This trade is one of the peculiarities of the American institution. It is called, in contradistinction to the foreign slave trade, the internal slave trade. This is probably so in order to divert from it the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated. That trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy. It has been denounced with burning words from the high places of the nation as an execrable traffic. To arrest it, to put an end to it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost to it on the coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as a most inhuman traffic, opposed alike to the laws of God and of man. In order to put an end to it, some of those in opposition have consented that their colored brethren, who are nominally free, should leave this country and establish themselves on the western coast of Africa. It is, however, a notable fact that while so much execration is poured out by the Americans upon those engaged in foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass by without any condemnation, and their business is even declared honorable. Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the marketplace. Do you know what a swine driver is? I will show you a man driver. They inhabit all of our southern states. They perambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human fields of jobbers armed with pistol, armed with whips and bowie knives, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave markets down in New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots or in suits to purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mills. Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along the trail, and the inhuman wretch who drives. Hear his savage yells and his blood-curdling oaths as he hurries on his frightened cactus. There, see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the slow babe in her arms. See too, that girl of 13, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The procession moves on. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed all of their strength, when suddenly you hear the snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank, the chains rattle, and simultaneously your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have been torn to the very center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the little babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child in the sun. That gash on her shoulder demands that she move anyway. Follow this procession on to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See the men examined like horses. See the bodies of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See the droves sold and separated forever. And never forget the deep and sad sobs that arose from those that were scattered. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun you can witness a spectacle more fiendish and more shocking. Yet this is but a glance at the American slave trade as it exists at this moment in the ruling parts of the United States. But a still more inhuman, more disgraceful, more scandalous state of things remains to be presented. By an act of the American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in the most horrible and degrading form. By that act, Mason and Dixon line has been obliterated, and the power to hold, to hunt, and to sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but it is now an institution of the whole United States. Your broad Republican domain is hunting ground for men. Not for thieves, not for robbers who are the enemies of society, but for men guilty of no crime. Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your secretary of state, your lords, your nobles, and your ecclesiastics enforce as a duty not fewer than 40 American slaves in the past 2 years have hunted down and without a moment's warning hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. For black men there is neither law nor justice, humanity nor religion. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judges who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery and $5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any 2 villains is sufficient under this hell-black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony means nothing. He can bring no witnesses for himself. The minister of American justice is bound by law to hear but one side, and that is the side of the oppressor. In glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangements to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolically intent, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation. I doubt if there be another nation on this globe having the brass and the baseness to put such a law on the statutes.
Amen.
I take this law to be one of the grossest infringements of Christian liberty. And if the churches and ministers of our country were not stupidly blind and most wickedly indifferent, they too would regard this as so. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds itself to be false to the future.
Amen.
Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and the great shame of this nation. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or who is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right and just. But it is in this moment that I hear some in the audience say, it is just this kind of circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public. If you would argue more and denounce less, the cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? Or what branch of the subject do the people of this country need a light to shine on it? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded already. Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he might be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the same punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of a slave to read or to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beast of the fields, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls in the air, when the cattle in your hills, when the fish of the sea and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from the brute, only then will I argue with you that the slave is not a man. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. It is not astonishing, even to you, that while we are plowing, planting, reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to all other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as households, wives and children, and above all, while confessing and worshiping your Christian God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving the doubtful application of the principles of justice? How should I look today in the presence of Americans, dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. I submit there is not a canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What? Am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations with their fellow man, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction? to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and sustained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employment for my time and strength than such arguments as those. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine.
Amen.
Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can may do it. I cannot. The time for such arguments has passed. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, that I had the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind. We need the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power in the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 million of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crowded heads of tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourself on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to be mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores frightened oppressors from abroad, honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives from oppression in your own land, you advertise, you hunt them, you shoot them, you kill them, and you arrest them. You glory in your refinement and your universal education, yet you maintain a system that is as barbarous and dreadful as ever, stained with the character of a nation begun in avarice, supported in pride, and perpetuated in cruelty. You shed tears over the fallen hungry, and you make the sad story of her wrongs the theme of your poets, statesmen, and orators. But in regard to the 10,000 wrongs of the American slaves, you would enforce the strictest of silence and would hail him as an enemy of the nation who dares to make those wrongs the subject of any public discourse. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all nations of man to dwell on the face of the earth, and both commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet you notoriously hate and even glorify in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own. You declare before the world and are understood by the world to declare that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, you hold securely in a bondage which is worse than that which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose, a seventh part of the inhabitants of your country. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of this nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work toward the downfall of the slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of this age. Nations do not stand in the same relation to each other that they did years ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot around in the same old path of its fathers without anyone interfering. Long-established customs of hurtful character could formally fence themselves in and do their evil work with social impunity. Knowledge has then confirmed and enjoyed by the privileged few, and the multitude walked on in a certain mental darkness. But a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong cities. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of this globe. It takes on the pathway over and under the sea as well as through the oceans. Oceans no longer divide but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively analytic. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other side. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existing of slavery in this country brands your politicians as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie.
Amen.
It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. Slavery saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force of your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs, endangers, and ultimately will destroy your nation. Slavery fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it. And yet, you cling to it as if it were the sheet anchor of everything you hope for. Be warned. Be warned. A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breath of this young republic. For the love of God, tear it away and fling it from you, this hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever. Destroy slavery forever.
We have to remember this is 1852.
Right.
No age of nothing. The phone wasn't invented. Morse code was just barely going. There was no visible means of communicating. And this black man had the audacity, the mitigated gall to stomp on a white man.
Yes.
Without any hesitation, without any fear, and I have thought myself a relatively decent historian. I had thought myself that I understood who we were and who the ones that went before us were. It is true, that is the most bodacious statements by a black man ever performed on this planet.
Further remember, self-educated, no formal schooling. The law said people could be jailed, fined, and other things put against them if they were caught trying to educate a black person. He had to fend for himself. He had to want it and be creative enough to get it, because it wasn't given to him. There was no affirmative action. He was not sitting around waiting on the Supreme Court to make a affirmative decision. He didn't feel that his life was not valid because someone else was not encouraging him. He knew within him, I'm a child of the living God, and even though they may say I'm nobody, I know I'm somebody.
Before Jesse Jackson said it, before Obama spoke, and we were just talking about how we refuse to read, we refuse to educate ourselves, we refuse to fight, we refuse to vote. We always look for unreasonable excuses. And here again, as I close, I was just sitting over there because when he talked about the Republicans, because we have to remember that the Republican Party during that particular time had taken over from the Whigs and was now the party that ruled.
Right.
We have to remember that it was and it has been the churches that perpetuated slavery. Even today. So, I'm done. Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass.
Thank you. Thank you. And the last thing, if when you post on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, make sure we post that on the 4th, we ain't celebrating, you read what Frederick Douglass, that should be your celebration. You need to read that and reread that And those brothers and sisters that got podcasts need to read that and speak on that. Because that is the truth.
Have understanding.
And wisdom.
Thank you. And wisdom. Thank you, Dr. Jones.